Now, this lecture, we're going to talk about the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. Now, this ends the war in World War II. Prior to this, Germany had already surrendered, and so the war in Europe was done, the cleanup was happening, but in Asia, Japan continued to still keep fighting. So how do we end the war in Asia, and specifically, how do we end it with Japan? We're going to try to provide you with some important information regarding this decision. And one thing to remember is there are no easy or good decisions that were available for the military or for President Truman when they're faced with this decision. Now, before we list the number of individuals who were killed or who were injured in Japan, I think it's important to realize that statistics can be very impersonal. It's difficult to understand the true human cost that losing a large number of your citizens can do to a country. Let me read you this quote by Jonah Lehrer. "The trouble with statistics is they don't activate our moral emotions. Depressing numbers of needy people leave us cold. Our minds can't comprehend suffering on a massive scale. This is why we're riveted when one child falls down a well, but turn a blind eye to millions of people who die every year for lack of clean water. Or why we donate thousands of dollars to help a single African war orphan featured on the cover of a magazine." I think that's very important when we look at these numbers here to keep those things in mind. Now, firebombing had been happening for months before the decision to use the atomic bombs. Now, these bombs, the containers of the firebombs, they were filled with something called napalm, which is a jelly-like material, and it spreads and it ignites and starts fires when it hits the ground. Now, the buildings in Tokyo, they were built out of wood and tar paper. Now, once these bombs were dropped on these buildings, absolutely a huge firestorm of a massive scale burned through the city, and most of the city had been burned to the ground from these bombing runs. Most of us know something about the two atomic bombs. They were nicknamed Fat Man and Little Boy. These were the ones that were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But most people really don't know anything about the firebomb campaign that had occurred before that in Tokyo. Now, look at the deaths in each city. The fire raids in Tokyo, they killed really a comparable number of the people that died in the two atomic bombs. These are big, big numbers. Now look at the area that was destroyed. And that's one thing that we look at atomic bombs and we say they're so incredibly powerful. Look at the areas that they can destroy with one single bomb. But the area destroyed by the fire raids was nearly 4 times greater than the combined areas of both atomic bombs. Now, there are arguments, and several valid arguments, that support using atomic bombs on Japan. And there's several valid arguments against using the atomic bombs on Japan. Now, first, I'll talk about both of these, but first I want to talk about the arguments that are used that supported using atomic bombs on Japan. Now, the Japanese, both military and civilians, they were not surrendering when faced with defeat. In fact, there were huge mass suicides on the island of Saipan by Japanese civilians who preferred to die rather than to surrender to American forces. Japan had run out of skilled pilots, and so they trained kamikaze pilots. Now, they trained their new pilots to not deliver bombs to their targets, but they were to dive bomb their planes with themselves in it when they found American ships. It was a suicide mission. Now, 100,000 Japanese civilians had already been killed by firebombing in Tokyo, and the leaders of Japan, they really showed no indication whatsoever of giving up or even slowing down. An American invasion would have been deadly, and in fact, it possibly would have been very much more deadly on both sides than using an atomic bomb attack. Estimates were as high as millions of American casualties would have occurred. Now, we just got done talking about D-Day and the beaches of Normandy and how impressive those numbers are, and just in an incredibly depressing way that there were so many people that sacrificed their lives so we could take that beach. We wouldn't be talking about D-Day today. If we would have invaded Japan, all we would be talking about is the number of lives that were lost in invading Japan. Now, not only American casualties, but estimates for Japanese casualties were as high as 10 million, so 10 times the amount of what would have lost the American casualties. So even if President Truman had decided not to use atomic bombs and decided to use firebombing techniques anyway, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they would have been firebombed and destroyed anyway, so what's the big deal in using atomic bombs? So those are the major arguments that people use to say, hey, using the atomic bombs was the right decision. Now, the arguments against using bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're equally as valid as well, too. Now, there was something called an unconditional surrender, and this is what the United States said. It said, basically, Japan, when you're ready to give up, you're going to give up, and you're not going to be able to negotiate how you're going to give up. You have to give up unconditionally. And that unconditional surrender that the U.S. was requiring of the Japanese really was unrealistic. And it was unrealistic because the Japanese viewed the leader of their country as literally as a god. So to surrender would mean that they were turning their back on not only their leader, but also turning their back on their god. And that was too much to ask of them. A demonstration over Tokyo Harbor, that would have convinced the Japanese that there was no way they could defend themselves against this type of weapon, and they would have surrendered. A major reason that the bombs were used was to justify spending $2 billion on their development. It was an incredibly expensive project. And once you have a toy, once you build a toy, you don't just want to mothball the thing and put it away in storage. You want to use it. So the bombs were used to justify spending that much money on the development. And then the last argument against using atomic bombs is that if the U.S. would have firebombed the cities, it would have been just as effective in destruction, and the U.S. wouldn't have the distinction of being the first and the only country to use an atomic weapon during a time of war. So those are the major decisions, the major arguments used in saying that we should not have used atomic bombs to end the war with Japan. But really, what is the best decision? Now we come to the question of really what was the best decision. Ultimately, we had to find a way to end the war with Japan. And what was the best way to do this? There were absolutely no easy answers. The pro and con arguments have some very, very valid points. The Japanese had shown no realistic indication of surrendering at all. Invading the islands of Japan would have resulted in unimaginable deaths on both sides, and using firebombs would have killed as many, if not more, civilians. And any approach, whether we're talking about invasion, firebombs, or atomic weapons, they would have resulted in the death of a tremendously large number of civilians. There's just no way, just absolutely no way to get around those things. These are the decisions that they were faced with. And again, understand that there's no easy or even any good answers. And ultimately, this is a situation that when you get into wartime, you have very, very limited options. And sometimes none of those options are good options. And that's the situation that we got into here. At the end of World War II, how do we stop this thing? How do we stop it? So now you've learned a little bit more about the atomic weapons. The next question I'm going to ask you is, what do you think? What would have been the best approach? You were going to have the ear of the president. You would be an advisor to President Truman. What would you suggest that he do now that you know this information?